Hello, dear friends. The snow lies soft and white over St. Mary Mead this Christmas morning. Carol singers move from door to door, their voices bright and cheerful. Inside warm kitchens, pudding steam and children tear open bright paper. Everywhere there is laughter, light, and the simple joy of the season. But in one house, the joy has already ended. Beneath a beautifully decorated Christmas tree, a prominent villager lies dead. And while the village sings and exchanges gifts, someone is counting on the noise, the comings and goings, and the general happiness to hide what they have done. A murder planned long before the first carol was sung. Miss Marple will soon notice what others do not. She always does. So make yourself comfortable, pour a warm cup of tea, and settle in. The fire is lit, the lights are glowing, but something cold is waiting in the shadows. This is the story of Miss Marple and the Christmas morning corpse. The eve of Christmas, Miss Marple sat by the window of her cottage, her knitting needles moving in their usual steady rhythm. It was the afternoon of Christmas Eve, and already the light was beginning to go. A pale winter sun hung low over the church tower, and the frost that had come in the night still lay white along the edges of the garden path. From where she sat, she could see the high street quite clearly. People were hurrying about with parcels and baskets, their breath showing in little clouds. Children ran past carrying paper chains, and from the direction of the church came the sound of the choir, practicing the last carol for the evening service. She paused in her knitting and looked out thoughtfully. It was all very much as it should be. St. Mary Mead always grew a little brighter at this time of year, as if the village made a special effort to look cheerful. The shops had put up their usual decorations. A few sprigs of holly in the window of the grocer's, and coloured paper lanterns in the sweet shop. Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, had been round that morning with a basket of mistletoe she had cut from the big tree in the vicarage garden. Miss Marple had taken a small piece and hung it over the door, though she had no real expectation of anyone standing under it. "Well," she said to herself, "it is Christmas, after all." She had finished the little matinee jacket she was making for the new baby at the vicarage, and was now working on a pair of socks for the Colonel. Colonel Reginald Hawthorne lived in the largest house on the far side of the green. The Larches, it was called. He had been a soldier once, and though he had been retired for some years, he still carried himself very straight. Most people in the village respected him, even if they found him a little stiff in his manner. He had lost his wife some time ago, and this year his daughter and her husband were coming down from London to spend Christmas with him. Miss Marple had heard that from Mrs. Phipps, the Colonel's housekeeper, who came in twice a week to do for him. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the Colonel was looking forward to the visit. He had seemed rather preoccupied when she had met him 2 days earlier outside the post office. He had been carrying a large brown paper parcel and had hardly seemed to notice her at first. "Colonel Hawthorne," she had said, "I do hope your daughter's train will not be delayed. The weather can be so uncertain at this time of year." He had looked at her rather sharply. Then his face had softened a little. "Yes, yes. Eleanor and young Grant are due this evening. I've told Phipps to have everything ready. The tree is already up, of course. She always likes that." He had seemed about to say something more, then had changed his mind and wished her good day. Miss Marple had watched him walk away, the parcel tucked under his arm, and had thought that he looked older than usual. But then she told herself, Christmas could be a tiring time for anyone who had to make preparations. She herself had found it quite enough to remember which cards still needed posting. Now, sitting by the window, she wondered if she ought to have offered to help in some way. But the Colonel was not the sort of man who welcomed help easily. He liked things done properly and in their proper time. Still, there had been something in his manner the other day. She shook her head slightly and went back to her knitting. It was no good imagining things. At her age, one saw shadows where there were none, especially when the light was fading. A knock at the door made her put the knitting aside. It was young Tommy from the sweet shop, bringing the box of chocolates she had ordered for the vicar's children. "Merry Christmas, Miss Marple," he said, stamping his feet on the mat. "Mum says the new stock of crystallized ginger came in this morning if you still want some." "Thank you, Tommy. And a Merry Christmas to you too. Tell your mother I may look in tomorrow if the weather stays fine." After he had gone, she stood for a moment in the little hallway, looking at the box. It was neatly wrapped in red paper, with a sprig of holly on top. Everything in the village seemed to have that extra touch of brightness just now. Even the old Mr. Sims at the garage had put a string of coloured lights round the petrol pump, which looked rather odd, but cheerful all the same. She decided she would take a short walk before it grew quite dark. There were one or two small things still to be done, and it would do her good to get a little air. She put on her thick coat and the woolen scarf she had knitted the previous winter and stepped out into the cold. The high street was busier than usual. Mrs. Bailey from the post office was just closing up and called out that there would be no more deliveries until after Boxing Day. Two women were standing by the butcher's shop, their baskets full, talking about the price of turkeys this year. Miss Marple passed them with a smile and a nod. She did not stop to join the conversation. At Christmas time, people were apt to stand about longer than usual, and she wanted to be home before the carol singers began their rounds. As she reached the green, she saw the Colonel's house across the way. The lights were on in the downstairs windows, and she could just make out the shape of the big Christmas tree in the front room. It looked splendid. Even from this distance, Colonel Hawthorne had always been particular about his tree. He brought it in himself from the woods beyond the village and decorated it with the same ornaments every year. Old glass balls and little wooden soldiers that had belonged to his own children when they were small. Miss Marple stood for a moment, watching the lighted windows. She thought she saw a figure move inside. Probably Mrs. Phipps, busy in the kitchen. Or perhaps the Colonel himself, making sure everything was just so before his daughter arrived. She hoped the visit would go well. Families did not always find it easy to be together for long periods, even at Christmas. There were often little frictions that only showed themselves when people were under the same roof for several days. She turned and began to walk back towards her own cottage. The first stars were coming out, and the air had grown sharper. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of singing. The choir must have finished their practice and were trying one of the carols in the open air. "God rest ye merry gentlemen." The words carried clearly on the cold air. Miss Marple smiled to herself. It was a good tune. She had always liked it. When she reached her gate, she paused again. The cottage looked welcoming with the light shining from the sitting-room window. She had left the lamp on, and the little Christmas tree she had put up on the table glowed softly. It was nothing grand, just a small silver tree with a few glass birds, but it was enough. Inside, she took off her coat and hung it carefully on the peg. The house felt pleasantly warm after the cold outside. She went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. While she waited for it to boil, she stood at the window again, looking out at the darkening garden. It really was a very pleasant Christmas Eve, she thought. Everything in its proper place. The carols, the lights, the parcels, the quiet excitement of children who could not quite believe that tomorrow had finally come. And yet, she frowned slightly. There had been something in the Colonel's face the other day when he spoke of his daughter's arrival. Not worry, exactly. More like a kind of watchfulness, as if he were waiting for something he did not particularly want to happen. Miss Marple shook her head. She was being fanciful. At Christmas time, the imagination could play strange tricks. People became sentimental, or else they became irritable for no good reason. It was the mixture of excitement and exhaustion, she supposed. The kettle began to whistle. She made herself a cup of tea and carried it back to her chair by the window. The knitting lay where she had left it. She picked it up, but for once her hands did not move at once. She sat looking out at the village, now almost hidden in the winter dusk. Somewhere out there, behind one of those lighted windows, someone was preparing for Christmas in their own particular way. Someone who had already decided that this year things would be different. Miss Marple did not know that yet, of course. She only knew that the Colonel had looked tired, and that the big house across the green had seemed very quiet, even with all its lights on. She took a sip of tea and began to knit again. Outside, the carol singers had started on another tune. Their voices rose and fell, cheerful and clear. Silent night. Holy night. Miss Marple listened for a moment, then went back to her knitting. The rhythm of the needles was steady and comforting. Tomorrow, she told herself, would be a good day. Christmas always was, in St. Mary Mead. She did not know then how wrong that thought would prove to be. Christmas morning, Miss Marple woke early on. Christmas morning, as she always did. The room was cold, and she could see her breath in the air when she first sat up. She put on her dressing gown and went downstairs to make tea. The little Christmas tree on the table looked pretty in the grey light coming through the window. She had left the presents for the vicar's children under it. A small wooden horse for the boy and a rag doll for the baby. They would come round later in the day. While the kettle boiled, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out. The frost was thick on the grass, and the sky was clear. It would be a bright day, though cold. From the direction of the church, she could already hear the bells beginning to ring for the early service. Children's voices carried across the green, excited and high-pitched. Somewhere a dog was barking. She poured her tea and took it into the sitting room. The socks she had knitted for Colonel Hawthorne were still on the arm of her chair, neatly wrapped in brown paper with a piece of string. She had meant to take them round yesterday evening, but had left it too late. Now she decided she would go before church. It was not much of a gift, but it was better than nothing, and the Colonel might appreciate something warm for his feet. Besides, she wanted to see how he was. That odd look he had worn outside the post office had stayed in her mind longer than she liked. She dressed carefully, put on her thick winter coat, and tied a woolen scarf round her neck. The parcel with the socks went into her basket, along with a small jar of her own damson jam, which she had decided at the last minute to take as well. She locked the cottage door behind her and set off across the green. The village looked very clean and bright in the morning light. Most of the cottages had smoke rising from their chimneys, and through uncurtained windows she could see Christmas trees lit up and families moving about inside. A group of children ran past her, calling out, "Merry Christmas, Miss Marple!" She smiled and answered them. One of them, a small girl with red mittens, was carrying a new doll and looked as though she could hardly believe her luck. The larches stood on the far side of the green, half hidden by its own trees. It was a solid, comfortable house, built of red brick with tall chimneys. As Miss Marple approached, she noticed that the curtains in the front windows were still drawn. That was unusual. Colonel Hawthorne was an early riser, even on Christmas Day. She had expected to see lights and perhaps the front door open as Mrs. Phipps came and went with last-minute tasks. She walked up the short drive and knocked on the door. She waited a moment, then knocked again, more firmly. Still nothing. She stepped back and looked up at the windows. One of the upstairs curtains moved slightly, as if someone had just let it fall back into place, but she could not be sure. "Well," she said quietly to herself, "perhaps they are all still asleep after the journey." But she did not really believe that. The Colonel was not the sort of man to lie in bed on Christmas morning. She tried the door handle. To her surprise, it turned easily. The door was not locked. She hesitated on the step. It was not her habit to walk into other people's houses uninvited, but something felt wrong. The house was too quiet. She could not hear Mrs. Phipps moving about in the kitchen, nor the usual sounds of a household getting ready for the day. "Colonel Hawthorne," she called, stepping just inside the hall. "It is Jane Marple. I have brought you a small Christmas gift." There was no reply. The drawing-room door stood half open. A faint light came from inside. "The Christmas tree lights," she thought. She crossed the hall and pushed the door wider. The room was warm. The big tree stood in its usual place by the window, its branches heavy with glass ornaments and tinsel. The lights were still burning, though the daylight was now strong enough to make them look pale. Under the tree, half lying on the carpet and half propped against the lower branches, was the body of Colonel Reginald Hawthorne. He was still in his dressing gown and slippers. One arm was stretched out as if he had been reaching for something on the floor. His head was turned slightly to one side, and his eyes were open. For a moment Miss Marple thought he must have fallen while arranging the last of the presents. There were several wrapped parcels scattered near him, and one small box had burst open, spilling coloured paper and string across the rug. Then she saw his face more clearly. She stood quite still in the doorway. The room was very quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. She noticed that the fire had gone out some time during the night. The ashes were cold. She noticed also that one of the lower branches of the tree had been pulled down and was resting across the Colonel's shoulder, as if someone had tried to cover him. Miss Marple moved forward slowly. She knelt beside him, not without difficulty, for her knees were not what they had once been, and felt for his pulse. There was none.
His skin was cold. She looked more closely at his neck and saw the dark marks just above the collar of his dressing gown. They were not the marks of a fall. She sat back on her heels. For a few seconds she did not move. Then she reached out and very gently closed his eyes. It seemed the proper thing to do. She got to her feet again and looked round the room. Nothing else appeared to have been disturbed. The presents under the tree were neatly arranged except for the ones that had fallen near the body. A glass stood on the small table beside the Colonel's usual chair. It contained the remains of what looked like whiskey and water. Beside it was an ashtray with a single cigarette stub. The Colonel had never been a heavy smoker, but he sometimes had one last cigarette before he went up to bed. Miss Marple's eyes went back to the body. The position was wrong. If he had simply collapsed while standing by the tree, he would not have ended up half under the branches in that particular way. And the marks on his neck. She turned and walked out into the hall. Her hands were steady, but she felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She went to the telephone that stood on the small table near the stairs and lifted the receiver. It took her a moment to remember the number she wanted. When the exchange answered, she asked for Dr. Haydock's house. The doctor's voice, when he came on the line, was brisk and cheerful. "Haydock here. Merry Christmas, whoever you are." "It is Jane Marple," she said. "I am at the Larches. Colonel Hawthorne is dead. I think you had better come at once." There was a short silence. "Dead? Are you sure?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I am quite sure, and I do not think it was a heart attack." She replaced the receiver and stood for a moment in the hall. Through the open drawing-room door she could see the lighted tree and the dark shape beneath it. She went back into the room and turned off the tree lights. It seemed wrong to leave them burning now. She was still standing there when she heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Mrs. Phipps came hurrying in, her face pink from the cold and from the effort of carrying a large basket. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began. "I'm ever so sorry I'm late this morning. The bus was delayed and—" She stopped. Her eyes went past Miss Marple to the drawing-room. The basket slipped from her hands and fell to the floor with a crash of breaking china. "Colonel!" she cried. "Oh, my goodness, Colonel!" Miss Marple caught her by the arm as she tried to rush forward. "No, Mrs. Phipps," she said quietly. "You must not go in there. Doctor, Haydock is on his way. Sit down here in the hall for a moment." "But what's happened? Is he ill? Has he had a turn?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She guided the housekeeper to the wooden settle by the front door and made her sit. Mrs. Phipps was trembling. "I found him a few minutes ago," Miss Marple said at last. "I am afraid he is dead." Mrs. Phipps gave a small, choked sound. She covered her face with her hands. "But he was all right last night," she said through her fingers. "He was sitting in there with his whiskey, looking at the tree. He said he wanted to put the last few presents out before he went to bed. He told me not to wait up, and now—" On Christmas morning, Miss Marple patted her shoulder gently. She did not say what she was thinking. That someone had known the Colonel would be alone in that room late on Christmas Eve, with the tree lights on and the house quiet after the carol singers had finished their rounds. Someone had known and had used that knowledge. She looked back towards the drawing-room. The tree stood dark now, its branches heavy with ornaments that no longer sparkled. Underneath it, half hidden by the lowest boughs, lay the body of a man
who had expected to spend Christmas with his daughter. Miss Marple's mouth tightened a little. This had not been an accident, and it had not been sudden. Someone had planned it carefully, and they had chosen their moment well. While the village sang carols and wrapped last-minute gifts and thought only of goodwill, someone had walked into this house and done what they came to do. She heard the sound of a car drawing up outside. Dr. Haydock, she thought. She went to open the door. Behind her, Mrs. Phipps was still crying quietly into her handkerchief. Miss Marple stood very straight in the doorway, waiting. The bright Christmas morning sunlight fell across the gravel and the frosted grass. From the church came the sound of the organ starting the first hymn. It was going to be a very different sort of Christmas from the one anyone had expected. Questions on Christmas Day, Dr. Haydock arrived within 10 minutes. He was a tall, thin man with a brisk manner and a habit of speaking his mind. He came straight into the drawing room without waiting to be shown, nodded briefly to Miss Marple, and went straight to the body. He knelt down, felt for the pulse that was not there, lifted one eyelid, and examined the marks on the neck with careful fingers. After a minute or two, he stood up again and looked at Miss Marple. "Well," he said, "you were quite right. This was no heart attack. Those marks are clear enough. Strangulation, and not by someone's bare hands either. Something thin, a cord or a strong piece of string, I should say. And it was done from behind, I think. He never had a chance to put up much of a fight." Miss Marple nodded. She had thought as much. "Time of death?" she asked. "Sometime last night, probably between 11 and 1. The body is quite cold, but not stiff yet. I'll know more when I can do a proper examination, but I can tell you now that this was not natural, and it was not an accident." He looked round the room. "The tree lights were still on when you found him?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I turned them off myself." "Odd," said the doctor. "A man doesn't usually leave the lights burning all night, even at Christmas. And he wouldn't have sat down under his own tree to die. Not in that position. Someone moved him after he was dead, or at least arranged him there. He went out into the hall to use the telephone. Miss Marple heard him asking for the police station. While he was speaking, Mrs. Phipps sat on the settle with her hands twisted together in her lap. She had stopped crying, but her face was white, and she kept glancing towards the drawing-room door as if she expected the Colonel to walk out of it at any moment. "I can't believe it," she said, more to herself than to Miss Marple. "He was sitting there last night with his whiskey, just like always. He said to me, 'Don't you wait up, Mrs. Phipps. I'll put the last of the presents out, and then I'll lock up.' And I went to bed."
"I always do when he tells me. And now this." Miss Marple sat down beside her. "Did anyone come to the house after you went upstairs?" she asked gently. "No one that I heard."
"But the Colonel sometimes let people in himself if they knocked late. He didn't like to keep Mrs. Phipps running up and down the stairs at night. And the door was not locked when I arrived this morning." Mrs. Phipps shook her head. "He must have forgotten. Or perhaps he let someone in and forgot to lock it after them. He wasn't always as careful as he should have been about that sort of thing." Dr. Haydock came back from the telephone. "The police are on their way," he said. "Inspector Graves from the county force. He'll want to ask both of you some questions. In the meantime, Mrs. Phipps, I think you had better make yourself a cup of tea. Strong and sweet, and perhaps you could put the kettle on for the rest of us as well. Mrs. Phipps got up obediently and went towards the kitchen. Miss Marple remained where she was. She was thinking about the unlocked door and the tree lights left burning. Small things, but they mattered. Inspector Graves arrived 20 minutes later with a sergeant and a constable. He was a solid-looking man in his 40s with a calm face and eyes that missed very little. He listened to Dr. Haydock's brief report, looked at the body for himself, and then asked Miss Marple and Mrs. Phipps to come into the dining room so that he could speak to them separately. Miss Marple went first. She sat at the polished table and answered the inspector's questions clearly and without fuss. She told him exactly what she had seen when she arrived, what she had touched, and what she had not. She mentioned the tree lights and the position of the body. She did not offer any theories. "You knew the Colonel well?" Inspector Graves asked. "As well as one knows most people in a village of this size," Miss Marple said. "He was not a man who made close friends easily, but he was respected. His daughter and her husband were expected today. I believe they were coming from London. We've sent someone to meet their train," the inspector said. "They'll be told what has happened before they get here. Now, Miss Marple, is there anything else you noticed? Anything that struck you as odd, even if it seemed small at the time?" Miss Marple hesitated. She thought of the Colonel's preoccupied look outside the post office 2 days earlier, and of the way he had seemed to change his mind about what he was going to say. But she did not mention it. Not yet. One could be mistaken about such things, and it was Christmas Day. People were allowed to look tired. "I think," she said at last, "that the Colonel was expecting his daughter and did not want to be disturbed while he finished arranging the presents. That is why he told Mrs. Phipps not to wait up." Inspector Graves made a note. He did not press her further. When he had finished with Mrs. Phipps as well, he asked them both to remain in the house for the time being. The doctor was still with the body, and the photographer had arrived. Miss Marple went into the kitchen and helped Mrs. Phipps make more tea. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Outside, more cars were drawing up. Word was spreading. In a village like St. Mary Mead, news travelled quickly, even on Christmas morning. By 11 o'clock, a small group had gathered on the green opposite the house. Miss Marple saw them from the dining room window. Mrs. Bailey from the post office, the vicar's wife, 2 or 3 of the shopkeepers, and old Mr. Sims from the garage. They stood in a knot, talking in low voices and glancing towards the larches. One of the women was holding a covered dish, as if she had been on her way to deliver something and had stopped when she heard the news. "It's not right," Mrs. Phipps said suddenly. "Not on Christmas Day. Whoever did this, they didn't care what day it was." "No," Miss Marple said, "they did not." She was still standing at the window when a taxi turned into the drive. A young woman got out first, followed by a tall man in a dark overcoat. The woman's face was pale and set. She came up the steps quickly and pushed open the front door without knocking. "Where is he?" she said. "Where's my father?" Miss Marple recognized her at once. "Eleanor Grant, the Colonel's daughter." The man behind her must be her husband, Philip Grant. He looked uncomfortable, as if he did not quite know what to do with his hands. Inspector Graves came out of the drawing room. He spoke quietly to Mrs. Grant, who gave a small, sharp cry and put her hand to her mouth. Her husband put an arm round her shoulders, but she shook it off almost at once. "I want to see him," she said. "I'm afraid that won't be possible just yet, madam," the inspector said. "The doctor is still with him. Perhaps if you would come into the dining room." Miss Marple moved away from the window. She did not want to intrude on the family's first shock. She went back into the kitchen and found Mrs. Phipps sitting at the table with her head in her hands. "They've come," Miss Marple said gently. "His daughter and her husband." "Mrs." Phipps looked up. Her eyes were red. "She won't believe it," she said. "Not until she sees him. And even then—" Miss Marple made another pot of tea. It seemed the only useful thing to do. While she waited for the kettle to boil, she thought about the people who had been in and out of the house over the past few days. Mrs. Phipps, of course. The Colonel himself. Possibly a delivery boy with the tree or the last of the groceries. And whoever had come late last night after Mrs. Phipps had gone to bed. Someone who knew the Colonel would be alone. Someone who knew he liked to sit by the tree with a glass of whiskey before he went upstairs. Someone who had planned this for long enough to know exactly when the house would be quiet and the village would be busy with its own celebrations. The kettle began to whistle. Miss Marple turned off the gas and poured the water into the teapot. She carried the tray into the dining room and set it down quietly on the sideboard. No one seemed to notice her. Inspector Graves was speaking to Mr. and Mrs. Grant in a low voice. Eleanor Grant was crying now, quietly and steadily. Her husband stood beside her chair, one hand resting on the back of it. He looked tired, Miss Marple thought. Or perhaps it was just the shock. She slipped out of the room again and went to find her coat. She had been at the Larches for nearly 2 hours. There was nothing more she could usefully do here at the moment, and she did not want to be in the way when the police began their more thorough search of the house. She found Inspector Graves in the hall. "I think I should go home now," she said, "unless you need me for anything else." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you for your help, Miss Marple. We may need to speak to you again later. You found the body, after all, and you seem to have a clear head." "I have lived in St. Mary Mead for a very long time," she said. "One notices things." He gave her a quick, appraising look, but did not ask what things she had noticed. Miss Marple walked back across the green. The group of people who had been standing there had grown larger. They fell silent as she passed. She nodded to one or two of them, but did not stop. She could feel their eyes on her back. When she reached her own cottage, she let herself in and took off her coat. The little Christmas tree on the table still looked cheerful. The presents for the vicar's children were still underneath it. She sat down in her usual chair and picked up her knitting. But her hands did not move. She was thinking about the unlocked door and the tree lights left burning. She was thinking about the Colonel's face 2 days earlier outside the post office. And she was thinking about how easy it would have been on Christmas Eve for someone to slip into the house while the carol singers were out and the village was full of noise and movement. Someone had done exactly that, and they had chosen their moment very well. Miss Marple put the knitting down again. She sat for a long time, looking out of the window at the bright, cold Christmas morning. The bells had stopped ringing. Somewhere in the distance, a child was laughing. She wondered how long it would be before the laughter stopped. afternoon thoughts, Miss Marple let herself into her cottage and closed the door behind her. The house felt very quiet after the activity at the Larches. She hung up her coat, put the kettle on again, and stood for a moment in the kitchen looking out at the garden. The frost was beginning to melt in the places where the sun reached it, but the shadows under the hedge were still white and sharp. She made herself a cup of tea and carried it into the sitting room. The little Christmas tree on the table looked almost mocking now, with its cheerful glass birds and the presents still underneath. She sat down in her usual chair and picked up her knitting, but after a few rows she put it down again. Her hands were steady, but her mind would not settle. She kept seeing the Colonel's face as she had found him. Half under the tree, the lights still burning, the glass of whiskey on the table beside his chair. And she kept thinking about the unlocked door. Colonel Hawthorne had been a careful man in most things. He would not have left the front door open on a winter night unless he had let someone in and forgotten to lock it afterwards, or unless he had known the person well enough not to bother. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The person who had come to the house last night had known the Colonel's habits. They had known he would be alone after Mrs. Phipps went to bed. They had known he liked to sit by the tree with a last drink. And they had chosen the one night when the village was full of noise and movement, when a strange footstep or a raised voice would not have been noticed. It had been planned, she was sure of that now. Not a sudden quarrel or a moment of anger. Something colder and more deliberate. She finished her tea and looked at the clock. It was nearly 12:30. She had promised to take the children's presents to the vicarage this afternoon. Mrs. Harmon would be expecting her. Besides, it would do her good to walk. Sitting here thinking would not help anyone. She wrapped the little wooden horse and the rag doll in fresh paper, put them in her basket, and set out again. The air was still cold, but the sun had come out properly now, and the village looked almost normal. A few people were walking to or from church. Children were playing with new toys on the green. From one of the cottages came the smell of roasting goose. Miss Marple walked slowly, nodding to those she passed. No one stopped her to ask questions, but she could feel the looks that followed her. By now everyone knew what had happened at the Larches. In St. Mary Mead, news of that sort did not need a telephone. The vicarage was warm and full of the usual Christmas clutter. Mrs. Harmon opened the door herself, her face pink from the kitchen. "Miss Marple, come in, do. I was just about to send one of the children to fetch you. The goose is in the oven and the pudding is steaming. We're a bit behindhand this year." Miss Marple stepped inside and handed over the basket. "I brought the children's things," she said. "I hope they will like them." "Oh, they will be delighted. You are always so thoughtful." Mrs. Harmon took the basket and set it on the hall table. She lowered her voice. "I suppose you have heard about poor Colonel Hawthorne? It's all over the village already. Such a dreadful thing to happen on Christmas Day." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I was there this morning." Mrs. Harmon's eyes widened. "You found him?" "I am afraid so. I had gone round with a small gift and the door was open." "How awful for you, and on Christmas morning too." Mrs. Harmon shook her head. "The police are still there, I believe. Inspector Graves came from the county. He seems a sensible man. But really, one hardly knows what to think. Who would do such a thing? And why on Christmas Eve, of all nights?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was looking at a sprig of holly that had fallen from the vicarage decorations and lay on the floor near the door. She bent down slowly and picked it up. "I wonder," she said almost to herself, "whether anyone saw anything unusual last night. The carol singers were out quite late, were they not?" "Yes, until nearly 11. They did the whole village, I think. They even went up to the big houses." Mrs. Harmon hesitated. "Do you think someone might have seen the person who went to the larches?" "It is possible," Miss Marple said. She put the holly on the table. "Mrs. Harmon, did the Colonel seem quite himself to you lately? I met him outside the post office a few days ago, and he looked rather tired." Mrs. Harmon considered. "Now that you mention it, he did seem a little distracted the last time I saw him. It was last week, I think. He was in the shop and he bought some stamps, but he forgot to take his change. Mr. Bailey had to call him back. He said something about having a lot on his mind with his daughter coming. Did he mention his son-in-law at all?" "No, but I did hear, and this is only gossip, of course, that young Mr. Grant had been down here on his own a week or so ago. He came on the train one afternoon and left again the same evening. Mrs. Phipps mentioned it to someone at the shop." Miss Marple nodded. She stored the information away without comment. They talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things. The children's excitement, the price of turkeys this year, the new curtains Mrs. Harmon was planning to make after Christmas. But underneath the ordinary words, there was a tension that had not been there before. Even in the vicarage, with the smell of goose and the sound of children laughing upstairs, the shadow of what had happened at the larches had reached them. When Miss Marple left, Mrs. Harmon walked with her to the gate. "If there is anything I can do," she said, "please tell me. Poor Eleanor must be quite distraught. And that nice Mrs. Phipps. I cannot imagine how she must be feeling." "I will let you know," Miss Marple said. She walked back towards the green more slowly than she had come. The information about Philip Grant's earlier visit was interesting. Why had he come alone? And why had the Colonel not mentioned it when she spoke to him outside the post office? She was still thinking about it when she reached her own gate. She had almost decided to go inside when she changed her mind. Instead, she turned and walked a little further, past the green and towards the lane that led to the back of the larches. She told herself she was only taking a longer way home, but she knew it was not quite true. The back gate of the Colonel's house was shut but not locked. She pushed it open and stepped into the garden. The ground was soft from the frost melting. She walked slowly along the path that led past the kitchen garden and round to the side of the house. From here she could see the drawing-room window. The curtains were still drawn. She stood for a moment, looking at the ground near the window. There were footprints in the soft earth. Several sets, overlapping. Some were clearly the heavy boots of the police. But there was one set, smaller and lighter, that seemed to lead from the garden path directly to the window, and then away again. They were not fresh. The edges had begun to blur as the frost melted. Miss Marple bent down to look more closely. The prints were pointed at the toe, like a woman's shoe or a man's lighter footwear. They had not been made by anyone in heavy police boots. She straightened up again. Her heart was beating a little faster than usual. She had not meant to come here looking for clues. She had only wanted a walk to clear her head. But now she had found something, and she did not know what to do with it. She should tell Inspector Graves, of course. But she had already spoken to him once today, and she did not want to seem as though she were interfering. Besides, the footprints might mean nothing at all. Someone could have walked round the garden at any time in the past few days. Still, she thought, it was odd that they led straight to the drawing-room window and then away. She turned and walked back the way she had come. As she reached the gate, she heard voices from the front of the house. Eleanor Grant and her husband were standing on the steps with Inspector Graves. Philip Grant was speaking, his voice low but carrying in the cold air. And I told him he was being unreasonable. But he wouldn't listen. He never did, once he had made up his mind. Miss Marple did not hear the inspector's reply. She slipped through the gate and walked quickly back towards her own cottage, her mind turning over what she had just heard. Philip Grant had argued with the colonel. Recently, it seemed, and he had come down alone a week earlier. She reached her gate and stopped. For a moment she stood quite still, looking at her own front door. Then she shook her head slightly. She was doing it again, jumping to conclusions on very little evidence. Philip Grant might have argued with his father-in-law about anything. Money, or the visit, or some family matter that had nothing to do with murder. And the footprints in the garden could belong to Mrs. Phipps, or the gardener, or anyone who had been round the back of the house in the last day or two. Still, she thought as she let herself in, it would not hurt to keep the possibility in mind. She went into the sitting room and sat down. The knitting was still where she had left it. This time she picked it up and began to work, the needles clicking steadily in the quiet room. Outside, the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. Another car drove past on the road beyond the green. Somewhere a door slammed. Miss Marple knitted on, her face calm and her eyes thoughtful. She had made a mistake this afternoon. She had gone looking for answers before she had enough questions. But she would not make that mistake again. Not until she was sure. Evening shadows. By the time Miss Marple reached home again, the light was fading fast. She drew the curtains, lit the lamp on the table beside her chair, and sat for a while without moving. The little Christmas tree still stood there, but she no longer found it cheerful. She kept thinking of the larger tree at the larches and the dark shape beneath it.
She ate a small supper. Some cold chicken and a slice of the cake she had baked the day before. But she had little appetite. When she had finished, she washed up the few dishes and put them away. Then she put on her coat once more and went out into the cold evening. She had decided to call at the Larches. It was the proper thing to do. One could not simply ignore what had happened to a neighbour, even if one had only known him in the ordinary way of village life. Besides, she wanted to see Eleanor Grant again. There were one or two things she wished to ask, if the opportunity arose. The house looked different in the evening. The police car was still outside, and a constable stood by the gate. He let her through when she explained who she was. Inside, the hall was dimly lit, and the drawing-room door was closed. From the kitchen came the sound of Mrs. Phipps moving about, though she sounded slower than usual. Eleanor Grant was in the dining room with her husband. They were sitting at the table with cups of tea in front of them, that neither of them seemed to have touched. Philip Grant stood up when Miss Marple came in. "Miss Marple," he said, "please sit down. It is very kind of you to come." Eleanor looked up. Her face was pale, and there were dark shadows under her eyes. But she spoke steadily. "You found him, didn't you?" "Mother told me. I'm sorry you had to see that."
It was a shock, Miss Marple said. She sat down in the chair Philip pulled out for her. I came this morning to bring him the socks I had knitted. I had no idea, of course. There was a short silence. Philip Grant sat down again and stared at his cup. The police have been very thorough, he said at last. They've been all over the house. They even took away the tree lights and some of the cord. I suppose they have to. Miss Marple's hands, which had been resting quietly in her lap, moved slightly. The tree lights, she said. Yes, one of the lengths of flex had been cut. They think that might have been what was used. He made a small, unhappy sound. On his own Christmas tree. It seems particularly cruel, somehow. Miss Marple did not reply at once. She was thinking of the marks she had seen on the Colonel's neck. A thin cord. Something that had been to hand in the room. The killer had not brought a weapon with him. He, or she, had used what was already there. That is very interesting, she said at last. I wonder how they knew the flex would be long enough. Philip looked at her sharply, but before he could speak, Eleanor broke in. Miss Marple, do you think it was someone from the village? Someone we all know? I think it must have been. Miss Marple said gently. Someone who knew your father's habits. Someone who knew Mrs. Phipps would go to bed early, and that he would be alone with the tree. Eleanor's mouth tightened. Father could be difficult, she said. He had strong opinions, and he did not like to be crossed. But I cannot believe anyone hated him enough to do this. Not here. Not on Christmas Eve. Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. Sometimes, she said, people do not need to hate. They only need to want something very much. Or to be afraid of losing something. Philip Grant moved in his chair. What are you suggesting? He asked. Nothing at all, Miss Marple said. Only that one must look at what people stood to gain or lose. It is usually the simplest explanation that turns out to be the right one, in my experience. She had spoken mildly, but she saw that her words had struck home. Philip's face had gone a little red. Eleanor was looking at her husband with an expression Miss Marple could not quite read. There was another silence. Then Eleanor pushed her cup away. I think I shall go upstairs for a little while, she said. I have a headache. Miss Marple, thank you for coming. It was kind of you. When she had gone, Philip remained at the table. He seemed to be struggling with something he wanted to say. Miss Marple, he began at last. I don't know what you may have heard, but my father-in-law and I did not always see eye to eye. He thought I was too free with money. He was probably right, but I would never have harmed him. Never. I am sure you would not, Miss Marple said. She stood up. I must not keep you. Please give my regards to your wife. She left the dining room and went into the hall. As she was putting on her coat, she saw Inspector Graves coming down the stairs. He looked tired. Miss Marple, he said. Still here. I came to offer my condolences, she said, and to return something I had borrowed. He held up a small pair of scissors she had taken from the hall table earlier without anyone noticing. It was a small deception, but it gave her an excuse to be there. The inspector looked at the scissors and then at her face. You have something on your mind, he said. Miss Marple hesitated. Then she decided. I was in the garden this afternoon, she said. At the back of the house. There are footprints near the drawing-room window. They are not police boots. A woman's shoe or a man's lighter one. They lead to the window and then away again. Inspector Graves studied her for a moment. You should have told me earlier, he said. "I was not sure they meant anything, and I did not want to interfere." He gave a short laugh that was not quite amused. "You are interfering now, Miss Marple, and I am glad of it. Come into the study for a moment." They went into the small room at the back of the house where the Colonel had kept his papers. The inspector closed the door. "The flex from the tree lights was cut with something sharp," he said. "We found a piece of it in the dustbin at the back. It matches the marks on the neck. Whoever did it used what was in the room. That suggests they did not come prepared with a weapon. They took the opportunity when it presented itself. Or they knew the flex would be there," Miss Marple said. "Exactly." He looked at her. "You said you saw the Colonel a few days ago. Did he seem worried about anything?" Miss Marple thought before she answered. "He seemed preoccupied, as if he had something on his mind that he did not wish to discuss. He mentioned his daughter's visit, but I had the impression there was more to it than that." Inspector Graves nodded. "We've been through his papers. There's nothing obviously wrong with his will. Everything goes to his daughter, with a small legacy to Mrs. Phipps. But there are some recent letters from a solicitor in London. It seems the Colonel was thinking of making changes. Nothing definite yet, but he had asked for advice about setting up a trust for a local project. Something to do with the village hall, I think." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "That would have reduced the amount his daughter would inherit," she said. "It would," the inspector agreed. "Not by a huge amount, but enough to matter if someone was counting on it." He did not say anything more, but Miss Marple understood what he was thinking. Philip Grant had money troubles. Eleanor stood to inherit less if her father changed his will. And someone had known enough about the Colonel's habits to come to the house on Christmas Eve and wait for the right moment. Miss Marple put the scissors down on the desk. "I think," she said, "that whoever did this was someone the Colonel knew well enough to let into the house late at night, and someone who was desperate enough to act on Christmas Eve, when the village would be too busy with its own affairs to notice." Inspector Graves looked at her for a long moment. "You may be right," he said, "but I would be grateful if you did not share that thought with anyone else just yet. Not even with Mrs. Grant." "I understand," Miss Marple said. She left the house a few minutes later. The constable at the gate nodded to her as she passed. The night was very clear and cold. Stars shone above the rooftops, and from one of the cottages came the faint sound of a wireless playing carols. Miss Marple walked home slowly. She was thinking about the cut flex and the footprints in the garden. She was thinking about Philip Grant's red face, when she had spoken of people wanting something very much. And she was thinking about the Colonel's face outside the post office, tired and preoccupied, as if he already knew that something was wrong and did not know how to put it right. She had made a mistake that afternoon. She had gone looking in the garden without telling anyone. She had almost told Eleanor and Philip more than she should have. She would not make that mistake again. But she would not stop looking either. Someone insane. Mary Mead had used the noise and the cheer of Christmas to hide a cold and careful murder. And they had very nearly succeeded. Miss Marple reached her gate and stopped for a moment, looking back at the dark shape of the larches across the green. Then she went inside, closed the door, and turned the key in the lock. For the first time in many years, she locked her door on Christmas night. What Mrs. Phipps remembered. The day after Christmas dawned cold and grey. The frost had returned in the night, and the village looked as though it had drawn in on itself. The excitement of the day before had gone, replaced by a quieter, more subdued feeling. Even the children seemed less noisy as they played with their new toys. Miss Marple woke early and made her tea as usual. She had not slept well. Her mind kept returning to the cut length of flecks from the Christmas tree lights and to Philip Grant's face when she had spoken of people wanting something very much. She had not meant to say so much. It had slipped out, and she had seen at once that it was a mistake. Philip had looked at her with something close to dislike, and Eleanor had left the room soon afterwards. She finished her tea and dressed. There was something she wanted to do before the day grew any older. Mrs. Phipps was staying with her sister in the lane behind the church. Miss Marple decided she would take her a small basket, some of the cake she had left, and a jar of the damson jam. It was a neighbourly thing to do, and it would give her an excuse to talk to the housekeeper without seeming to pry. Mrs. Phipps's sister lived in one of the smaller cottages. When Miss Marple knocked, it was Mrs. Phipps herself who opened the door. She looked tired and older than she had the day before, but she managed a small smile when she saw who it was. "Miss Marple, how kind of you. Do come in. My sister's gone to the shop, but she won't be long." Miss Marple stepped inside. The cottage was warm and smelled of baking. She set the basket on the table and sat down in the chair Mrs. Phipps offered. "I thought you might like something sweet," she said, "and I wanted to see how you were." Mrs. Phipps sat down opposite her. For a moment she did not speak. Then she said, in a low voice, "I keep thinking about it. About him sitting there with his whiskey, looking at the tree. He was always particular about that tree. Every year the same ornaments, in the same places. He said it made him feel that some things didn't change, even when everything else did." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he seem worried about anything that day?" she asked. "Christmas Eve, I mean. Before he sent you to bed." Mrs. Phipps hesitated. "He was quiet all afternoon," she said at last. "He had a telephone call in the study after lunch. I wasn't listening, of course, but the door was open a little and I heard him raise his voice. He said something like, 'I won't be pushed into it, not by you or anyone else.' Then he was quiet for a long time. When he came out, he looked tired. He told me I could go up early if I wanted. He said he had some things to finish and he didn't want to be disturbed." Miss Marple's hands were folded quietly in her lap. "Did he say who had telephoned?" "No, but I think it was his son-in-law. Mr. Grant had been down the week before, you know. They had words then too. I heard them in the study. Mr. Grant was asking for money again. The Colonel said he had helped enough and that it was time Philip stood on his own feet. Then Mr. Grant said something about not being able to wait much longer, and the Colonel told him to leave." Miss Marple was very still. "And on Christmas Eve," she said, "did Mr. Grant telephone again?" "I think so. The Colonel didn't say the name, but the way he spoke. It was the same tone he had used the week before." Mrs. Phipps looked down at her hands. "I should have stayed up. If I had stayed up, perhaps it wouldn't have happened." "You must not blame yourself," Miss Marple said gently. "You did as you were told, and you could not have known what would happen." They sat in silence for a minute. Then Mrs. Phipps said, almost in a whisper, "Do you think it was him, Mr. Grant?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "I think," she said, "that whoever came to the house that night knew exactly when Mrs. Phipps would be in bed and when the Colonel would be alone. They knew he would have the tree lights on and a glass of whiskey beside him. And they used something that was already in the room to do what they did. That suggests someone who had been in the house before and who knew its ways. Mrs. Phipps nodded slowly. Mr. Grant had been in the house many times, she said. He knew where everything was, and he knew the Colonel's habits better than most. Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Phipps, and for telling me what you remembered. It may be important. She left the cottage a few minutes later. The lane was empty. She walked slowly back towards the green, thinking about what she had heard. Philip Grant had been asking for money.
The Colonel had refused. There had been an argument the week before, and another telephone call on Christmas Eve afternoon. And now the Colonel was dead, strangled with a piece of flex
from his own Christmas tree, on the one night when the village would be too busy to notice a visitor coming and going. It fitted almost too neatly. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that things which fitted too neatly were sometimes arranged that way on purpose. She did not want to make the same mistake she had made the day before, jumping too quickly to a conclusion. Still, she thought, it was a very strong possibility. She reached the green and stood for a moment looking across at the larches. The police car was gone, but there was still a constable on duty at the gate. As she watched, Eleanor Grant came out of the house and spoke to him. She was wearing a dark coat and a scarf over her head. She looked small and alone. Miss Marple felt a sudden pang of sympathy. Whatever Philip Grant had done or not done, Eleanor had lost her father on Christmas Eve. That was real, and it was cruel. She turned away and began to walk towards her own cottage. She would go home and think. She would not rush to the inspector with what Mrs. Phipps had told her. Not yet. She would wait until she was sure there was nothing else she had missed. But as she reached her gate, she saw Inspector Graves coming along the road from the other direction. He raised a hand when he saw her. "Miss Marple," he said when he reached her. "I was just coming to see you. I have some news." She waited. "We've had the report from the pathologist," he said. "The time of death is now more certain. Between 11 o'clock and midnight on Christmas Eve. And there are no other marks on the body. No signs of a struggle beyond the neck. He was taken by surprise from behind." Miss Marple nodded. "That fits with what I thought," she said. "He was sitting in his chair by the tree. Someone came up behind him while he was looking at the lights or reaching for his glass. There's something else," the inspector said. "We found a partial footprint on the carpet near the body. It's small, a woman's shoe or a man's light shoe. It doesn't match any of the family's shoes that we've checked so far. And it doesn't match Mrs. Phipps." Miss Marple thought of the footprints she had seen in the garden the day before. "Perhaps the same person who walked round the back of the house," she said. "Perhaps," Inspector Graves agreed. "We're checking all the shoes in the village that we can. It's slow work on Boxing Day, but we're doing it." He looked at her. "You went to see Mrs. Phipps this morning," he said. It was not a question. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "News travels quickly in St. Mary Mead." "It does. Did she remember anything useful?" Miss Marple hesitated for only a second. Then she told him about the telephone call on Christmas Eve afternoon and the argument the week before. She did not mention Philip Grant's name, but she did not need to. The inspector understood at once. "Thank you," he said when she had finished. "That confirms what we were beginning to suspect. We'll speak to Mr. Grant again this afternoon." He turned to go, then stopped. "Miss Marple," he said, "I know you have a reputation in this village for seeing things other people miss. If you notice anything else, anything at all, I would be grateful if you would tell me, even if it seems small." "I will," she said. When he had gone, she went inside and took off her coat. She sat down in her chair by the window and picked up her knitting. This time her hands moved steadily. She worked for nearly an hour without stopping, the needles clicking in the quiet room. She was thinking about Philip Grant and the telephone call. She was thinking about the cut flecks and the small footprint on the carpet. And she was thinking about Eleanor Grant's pale face as she had stood on the steps of the Larches that morning. There was still something that did not quite fit. Something she had seen or heard, but had not yet placed properly in the pattern. She would find it, she always did, in the end. But she hoped she would find it before anyone else was hurt. Outside, the grey sky had begun to clear a little. A thin winter sun shone on the frost-covered roofs of St. Mary Mead. From the church came the sound of the organ practising for the Sunday service. Miss Marple knitted on, her face calm, and her mind busy with the pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. Tea with Eleanor Boxing Day passed slowly in St. Mary Mead. The shops were closed, and most families stayed indoors with their new gifts and leftover food. The weather remained cold, with a thin wind that found its way through even the best closed doors. The police were still about, though more quietly now. Inspector Graves had taken a room at the small inn near the green, and his men moved from house to house, asking the same careful questions. Miss Marple spent the morning at home. She finished the pair of socks she had been knitting and wrapped them in tissue paper. She would give them to someone who needed them, though she no longer knew to whom. The Colonel would not wear them now. In the afternoon she put on her coat and walked across the green to the Larches. The constable on duty let her in without question this time. She found Eleanor Grant alone in the drawing-room. The big Christmas tree had been taken down and stood in pieces in a corner, its ornaments packed away in their boxes. The room looked bare without it. Eleanor was sitting by the fire with a book open on her lap that she did not seem to be reading. She looked up when Miss Marple came in. "Miss Marple, please sit down. I was just about to ask Mrs. Phipps for some tea. Will you have a cup?" "Thank you," Miss Marple said. She sat in the chair opposite. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "You are not. It is better to have company than to sit here alone with one's thoughts." Eleanor closed the book. "The police have been very kind, but they ask so many questions. I find it tiring." Miss Marple accepted the cup of tea. Mrs. Phipps brought in. When the housekeeper had gone, she said gently, "Your husband is not with you today. Philip has gone to London for a few hours. He had some business to attend to. He will be back this evening." Eleanor looked into the fire. "He has been very good. I know he and Father did not always agree, but he has tried to help with everything." Miss Marple took a sip of tea. It was hot and strong, just as she liked it. "I am sure he has," she said. "These things are never easy for families." They sat in silence for a minute. Then Eleanor spoke again, almost as if she were talking to herself. "Father was going to change his will," she said. "He told me on the telephone last week." He said he wanted to set up a trust for the new village hall. It would have taken a good part of what he had. Philip was very upset when I told him. He said it was unfair, that father was being influenced by people in the village who only wanted his money for their own schemes. Miss Marple put her cup down carefully. Did your father say who had been speaking to him about the trust? No, but I think it was the vicar, or perhaps one of the parish councillors. Father always took his responsibilities seriously. If he thought the village needed something, he would do what he could. Eleanor looked at Miss Marple. Do you think that is why he was killed? Because someone did not want him to change his will? Miss Marple chose her words with care. It is possible, she said, but one must not jump to conclusions too quickly. There may be other reasons. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Philip did not kill my father, Miss Marple. I know he can be difficult about money, and I know they argued. But he would not have come here on Christmas Eve and done that. He was in London. He told the police so. Miss Marple nodded, but she did not speak. She was looking at Eleanor's shoes, which were placed neatly by the fire to dry. They were small, with pointed toes and a low heel, the sort of shoes a woman might wear for walking in the village on a winter day. She thought of the small footprint the inspector had mentioned, the one on the carpet near the body. Eleanor, she said, did you come down to St. Mary Mead at all on Christmas Eve? Before your train the next morning, I mean. Eleanor looked surprised. No, I was in London. Philip and I had dinner with friends and we stayed at home afterwards. Why you ask? No reason, Miss Marple said, only that it must have been a long journey for you on Christmas morning, after what happened. She finished her tea and stood up. I must not keep you any longer. Thank you for the tea. Eleanor walked with her to the door. Miss Marple, she said suddenly, if you think of anything that might help the police, please tell them. I want to know who did this. Whoever it was, they took my father from me on Christmas Eve. I cannot forgive that. Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment. I will, she said. She walked back across the green more slowly than usual. The wind was colder now, and she pulled her scarf tighter round her neck. She was thinking about Eleanor's shoes and about the way she had spoken of her father's will. She was thinking about Philip's trip to London today and about the telephone call Mrs. Phipps had overheard. There was something that still did not fit. Something small but important. When she reached her cottage, she went inside and sat down by the window. She did not pick up her knitting. Instead, she sat very still, looking out at the darkening sky and the lights beginning to come on in the houses across the green. She had made a mistake again. She had assumed that because Philip had the strongest motive, he must be the one. But motives were not always simple, and people did not always act alone. She thought of the small footprint again. It could belong to a woman. It could belong to Eleanor. But why would Eleanor kill her own father? Unless she had known about the will change and had been desperate to stop it. Unless Philip's debts had become so bad that she saw no other way. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. She was doing it again, building a case on very little. She needed more than footprints and telephone calls. She needed something that could not be explained any other way. She would speak to Inspector Graves in the morning. She would tell him what Eleanor had said about the will and about Philip's reaction to it. She would mention the shoes, though she knew it was very little to go on, and then she would wait. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They drifted down slowly, settling on the roofs and the grass of the green. By morning the village would be white again, as if nothing had happened. But Miss Marple knew that something had happened, and that it was not finished yet. She sat by the window until the room grew dark around her, thinking about Christmas and about the cold heart that had used its cheer as a cover. Then she got up, drew the curtains, and turned on the lamp. Tomorrow she would begin again. The quiet. One Miss Marple did not sleep well that night. The snow had stopped falling by midnight, but the wind had risen, and it rattled the window frames and found every gap in the old cottage. She lay awake for a long time, going over everything in her mind. The cut flecks from the tree lights, the small footprint on the carpet and in the garden, Mrs. Phipps's account of the angry telephone call on Christmas Eve afternoon, Eleanor's own words about the will and about Philip's reaction to it, the shoes drying by the fire, and one other thing, something she had almost forgotten until now. When she had first found the Colonel's body, the lower branches of the tree had been pulled down across his shoulder, as if someone had tried to cover him. It had seemed a small, almost tender gesture at the time. But why would a killer do that? Unless they had felt a moment of regret, or unless they had wanted the body to be found in a particular way. Not immediately obvious, but not hidden either. Someone who had cared, just a little, even while they were doing what they had come to do. Miss Marple got up early. She made tea and sat by the window, watching the pale winter light creep across the snow-covered green. The larches looked quiet and dark on the other side. She thought of Eleanor sitting alone in the drawing-room the day before, her shoes by the fire, her face pale and tired. She had been too quick to look at Philip. She saw that now. Philip had the obvious motive and the obvious temper, but Eleanor had something else. The quiet desperation of someone who had lived for years with a husband who could not manage money, and who saw her only security about to be taken away. Miss Marple dressed and went out into the cold morning. The snow crunched under her boots. She walked across the green to the larches. The constable was still there, stamping his feet to keep warm. He let her in when she said she needed to speak to Inspector Graves. The inspector was in the study, going through papers. He looked up when she came in. "Miss Marple, you're early." "I have been thinking," she said. "May I sit down?" He pulled out a chair for her. "I have been thinking too," he said. "We've checked Philip Grant's movements. He was in London on Christmas Eve, but his alibi for the late evening is weak. No one can confirm he was at home after 10 o'clock, and we found out yesterday that his debts are worse than we thought. He was on the verge of losing everything." Miss Marple nodded. "But there is something else," she said. "Something I should have seen sooner." She told him about her visit with Eleanor the day before. She told him about the shoes by the fire and about the way Eleanor had spoken of her father's will. She told him about the pulled-down branch across the Colonel's shoulder. "And I remembered something Mrs. Phipps said," she went on. "She said the Colonel was particular about his tree. Every year the same ornaments in the same places. If someone had disturbed it to cover the body, they would have known how it should look. They would have known which branches to pull down." Inspector Graves was watching her carefully. "Go on." "I think Eleanor came down from London on Christmas Eve," Miss Marple said. "Not on the morning train, as she told us. She came earlier. Perhaps in the afternoon, after her father's telephone call with Philip. She knew what he was planning to do with his will. She knew it would ruin them. And she knew that on Christmas Eve the village would be full of noise and people moving about. No one would notice one more person coming and going. She paused. She let herself into the house. Her father was not surprised to see her. He may even have been expecting some sort of visit after the telephone call. She waited until Mrs. Phipps had gone to bed. Then she came into the drawing room while he was sitting by the tree. She came up behind him. She used the flex from the lights because it was there, and because it would look like an accident or a heart attack at first. When it was done, she pulled the branch across him. Perhaps she could not bear to look at what she had done. Then she left the house, locked the door behind her, or thought she had, and went back to London. The next morning she arrived with Philip, as if nothing had happened. Inspector Graves was silent for a long time. "It fits," he said at last. "The footprint, the timing, the knowledge of the house. But why did she come back the next morning? Why not stay away and let someone else find him?" "Because she wanted to be here when the body was found," Miss Marple said. "She wanted to control the story. And because she knew that if she arrived with Philip on Christmas morning, no one would suspect she had been here the night before. It was the perfect cover. The perfect Christmas confusion." She looked down at her hands. "I almost missed it," she said. "I was so sure it was Philip. He made it easy to suspect him. But it was Eleanor who had the most to lose, and the most to gain by acting quickly. And she was the quiet one, the one no one would look at twice." Inspector Graves stood up. "I need to speak to her," he said. "Will you come with me?" Miss Marple hesitated. "I think it would be better if you spoke to her alone first," she said. "But I will wait here if you like." He nodded and left the room. Miss Marple sat by the window in the study. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt in patches where the sun touched it. She could hear voices from the hall, the inspector's calm tone, and then Eleanor's, higher and sharper. She did not try to listen to the words. She had done what she could. The rest was for the police. After a while, the door opened, and Inspector Graves came back in. His face was grave. "She has admitted it," he said. "Not everything, but enough. She came down on Christmas Eve afternoon. She waited until the house was quiet. She says she only meant to talk to him, to persuade him not to change the will. But he refused. He said he had made up his mind, and then he did not finish the sentence." Miss Marple nodded. "She used what was to hand," she said. "The flex from the tree. It was the only thing she could be sure would work quickly and quietly." "Yes." They sat in silence for a moment. "I should have seen it sooner," Miss Marple said. "I let myself be distracted by Philip's temper and his debts. I forgot that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has the most to hide." "You saw it in the end," Inspector Graves said. "That is what matters." Miss Marple stood up. "I think I will go home now," she said. "There is nothing more I can do here." She walked back across the green. The snow was soft under her boots. Children were beginning to come out again, their voices bright in the cold air. From one of the cottages came the smell of baking. St. Mary Mead was trying to go back to normal. But it would not be the same for a while, not after what had happened on Christmas Eve. Miss Marple reached her gate and stopped. She looked back at the larches one last time. The curtains were drawn in the drawing room. She wondered if Eleanor was still there, or if the police had already taken her away. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness. Christmas cheer, she thought, could hide many things, even the coldest of hearts. She went inside and closed the door after Christmas. The days after Boxing Day passed quietly in St. Mary Mead. The snow melted and froze again, and the village went about its business with a kind of careful restraint. People still spoke of what had happened at the Larches, but they spoke in lowered voices and did not linger on the subject for long. It was not the sort of thing one wanted to think about too much at the beginning of a new year. Miss Marple heard the details gradually. Eleanor Grant had been charged and taken to the county police station. She had not made a full confession, but she had admitted enough for the police to be satisfied. She had come down from London on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, after the angry telephone call between her husband and her father. She had let herself into the house with her own key. She had waited until Mrs. Phipps went upstairs. Then she had gone into the drawing room. She said she had only meant to talk to him, she said. She had begged him not to change his will. But he had been stubborn, as he always was when he had made up his mind. He had told her that the village needed the trust more than she and Philip needed the money. And then, she said, something had snapped inside her. She had taken the flex from the tree lights, because it was there, and because it was strong. She had come up behind his chair while he was looking at the ornaments. Afterwards, she had pulled one of the lower branches across his shoulder. She could not say why she had done that. Perhaps she had not wanted to see his face. Then she had left the house, thinking she had locked the door behind her, and caught the last train back to London. The next morning she had arrived with Philip, as though nothing had happened. Philip Grant had been questioned again and released. His debts were real, but there was no evidence that he had known what his wife intended to do. He had gone back to London the day after Eleanor was charged. Miss Marple heard later that he had sold their flat and moved somewhere smaller. She did not know what had become of him after that. Mrs. Phipps had gone to stay with her sister for a while. The Larches stood empty, its windows dark. Someone would have to decide what to do with it eventually. But for now it was left alone. Miss Marple did not go near the house again. She had seen enough of it. On the morning of the 3rd of January, she woke to find the village covered in a fresh fall of snow. It was not deep, but it was enough to make everything look clean and new. She put on her thick coat and boots and walked slowly down the high street. The shops were open again. People were buying ordinary things, bread and milk and stamps. Life was trying to go back to the way it had been before Christmas. She stopped at the post office to buy a stamp for a letter she had written to an old friend. Mrs. Bailey was behind the counter, as usual. "Cold again this morning," Mrs. Bailey said. "I don't know what the weather thinks it's doing." "It has been a strange winter," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Bailey glanced at her and then looked away. "I still can't believe it," she said in a low voice. Miss Eleanor, of all people, she always seemed so quiet, so proper. "Quiet people can feel things very deeply," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes too deeply for their own good." She paid for the stamp and went out again. The snow crunched under her feet. As she passed the green, she saw Inspector Graves coming out of the inn. He raised a hand when he saw her and crossed the road to meet her. "Miss Marple," he said, "I was hoping to see you before I left. I'm going back to the county office this afternoon." The case is more or less finished here." "I am glad to hear it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You were right about Mrs. Grant," he said. "I should have looked at her sooner. I was too busy watching her husband." "We all make mistakes," Miss Marple said. "I made one myself. I was so certain it was Mr. Grant that I almost missed what was in front of me." The inspector gave a small smile. "Well, you put it right in the end. That's what counts." They stood for a moment in the cold air. Then Inspector Graves touched his hat. "Goodbye, Miss Marple. And thank you. Goodbye, Inspector." She watched him walk away towards his car. Then she turned and continued her walk. She went as far as the church and stood for a while in the porch, looking at the snow-covered gravestones. The bells were silent now. The carol singers had put away their music until next year. When she reached home, she made herself a cup of tea and sat down in her chair by the window. The little Christmas tree was still on the table. She had not taken it down yet. She would do it tomorrow, she decided. There was no hurry. She picked up her knitting. There was a new project now. A shawl for the vicar's wife, who had mentioned that she felt the cold more than she used to. The wool was a soft grey, and the pattern was simple. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. As she worked, she thought about Eleanor Grant. She thought about how easy it had been for her to use the noise and the movement of Christmas as a cover, while the village sang and laughed and exchanged gifts. Eleanor had walked into her father's house and done what she had come to do, and then she had walked out again and no one had noticed. It had been a clever plan. Cold, but clever. Miss Marple had almost been taken in by it herself. She had looked at Philip's temper and his debts, and had seen only what she expected to see. She had not looked closely enough at the quiet daughter who stood to lose everything if her father changed his will. She had been lucky this time. Next time she would be more careful. The needles clicked on. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt again where the sun touched it. Children were playing on the green, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. Somewhere a door opened and closed, and someone called out a greeting. St. Mary Mead was going on with its life. It always did. Miss Marple finished the row she was working on and put the knitting down for a moment. She looked out at the village, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, and the lights beginning to come on in the windows as the afternoon faded. People were capable of great kindness, she thought. They were also capable of great coldness. Sometimes both qualities lived in the same person, side by side, and you did not see the coldness until it was too late. She picked up her knitting again. The shawl would be finished by the end of the week if she kept at it. And then there would be something else to make. There was always something. Outside, the light was fading. Another day was ending in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple worked on, the needles moving steadily in her hands, while the village settled into the quiet of a winter evening.